When Barron Trump gave up his first-class seat to a pregnant woman, no one expected what would happen next. A simple act of kindness turned into a moment that left the whole plane stunned, and you won't believe the reason why. It was an unusually cold morning at the bustling JFK airport. The skies were overcast, and the ground crew hurried to prepare flights as passengers boarded. Among the crowd was a young woman in her mid-30s, her pregnant belly making her movements slower than most. She clutched her boarding pass tightly in one hand, the other resting protectively on her stomach. Her coat was a little snug, showing signs of wear, but it was neatly buttoned, as if she had taken extra care that morning. Her pale face looked tired, her steps hesitant, almost as if every step toward her seat carried the weight of something much heavier than just her pregnancy. As she made her way down the narrow aisle, she tried to avoid bumping into the other passengers. Her eyes scanned the rows, searching for her seat near the back of the plane. Though she kept her head down, there was something about her, a quiet sadness or perhaps worry that seemed to cling to her like the cold air outside. It was clear she was carrying more than just her baby. She was carrying a story, one that no one on the flight yet knew. Seated in first class, Barron Trump cut a striking yet understated figure. The youngest son of the former president, Barron was no longer the shy boy the world once glimpsed during his father's time in office. Now in his late teens, he stood tall, well over 6 feet, with a presence that quietly commanded attention. Unlike others who might revel in such privilege, Barron seemed uninterested in the perks of fame or luxury. By the window, he sat with his headphones on, engrossed in a thick hardcover book. His posture was relaxed, but there was an unmistakable air of quiet composure about him. Every so often, he glanced out at the runway, his expression thoughtful, as if lost in a world far removed from the bustling cabin around him. Passengers in first class occasionally cast curious glances his way, whispering softly, but Barron seemed oblivious or perhaps simply uninterested. To an outsider, he might have appeared like any other teenager absorbed in his own thoughts, but there was a quiet maturity in his demeanor, an unspoken grace that set him apart. He wasn't there to draw attention, he was simply another traveler on a cold winter morning, content in his own company. As the plane filled up, a soft commotion could be heard from the back. Sarah, the pregnant woman, had finally reached her assigned seat. It was a cramped spot in the middle row, wedged between a businessman who seemed glued to his laptop and a restless young boy kicking the tray table in front of him. Sarah settled in slowly, wincing as she tried to adjust her position. Her hands rested on her belly protectively, and a flicker of frustration crossed her face as she realized there wasn't much space to move. The businessman next to her barely glanced up, his attention fixed on the screen in front of him. On her other side, the boy's kicks continued, and though his mother seemed aware, she looked too frazzled to do anything. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the discomfort was evident. Her back ached, and the tight space made her feel even more tired. One of the flight attendants noticed her situation and gave her a sympathetic smile, but with the flight fully booked, there wasn't much that could be done. Sarah shifted again, closing her eyes for a moment, hoping the journey ahead wouldn't feel as long as it seemed. Barron sat quietly in his first-class seat, flipping through the pages of his book. The hum of the boarding process barely registered in his ears as he kept his headphones on, lost in his reading. But then, a small movement near the back of the plane caught his attention. He glanced up, his sharp eyes quickly finding the source, a pregnant woman struggling to settle into her seat. Something about her movements seemed off. She looked tired, her face pale, and her hands rested protectively over her swollen belly. Barron watched as she shifted in her cramped seat, trying to find even a small bit of comfort. Her body language spoke volumes. She was exhausted, stressed, and clearly struggling. The businessman next to her paid no attention, and the young boy on her other side continued to kick the tray table, oblivious to her discomfort. Barron removed his earbuds slowly, setting them on the armrest. He leaned back in his seat, but his focus remained on the scene unfolding at the back. He couldn't explain it, but something tugged at him, a small, persistent feeling that he couldn't ignore. It wasn't pity exactly, but rather a quiet concern that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Moments later, Barron pressed the call button for a flight attendant. His decision was sudden, but felt right. When the attendant arrived, she leaned in slightly, ready to assist. Barron spoke softly, keeping his tone calm but firm. "Excuse me," he said, looking directly at her. "There's a pregnant woman sitting in the back. I'd like to give her my seat." The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard. It wasn't every day that someone offered to give up their first-class seat, let alone a young man who carried such a recognizable name. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure if she had heard him correctly. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice holding a hint of surprise. "Yes," Barron replied, his words steady and certain. "Please let her know. She looks like she could use the comfort." The attendant nodded, a flicker of admiration softening her expression. Without wasting time, she made her way down the aisle to where Sarah was sitting. The sight of the weary, pregnant woman struggling in the cramped seat made the flight attendant even more appreciative of Barron's gesture. She crouched slightly to meet Sarah's tired eyes, her voice kind and gentle. "Ma'am," she began, smiling warmly, "one of our passengers has offered to switch seats with you. He's in first class." Sarah's eyes widened in disbelief. She instinctively placed a protective hand over her belly. "First class," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you sure this isn't a mistake?" "It's no mistake," the attendant reassured her, her tone soothing. "He noticed you looked uncomfortable and wanted to help. If you'd like, we can help you move now." For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say. Her emotions swirled gratitude, disbelief, and even a touch of guilt. But above all, there was relief. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she heard the flight attendant's words. "That's so kind," she whispered, her voice trembling with gratitude. She glanced down at her belly, silently thanking the stranger who had shown such unexpected compassion. With the attendant's gentle assistance, Sarah carefully stood up, steadying herself as she prepared to move. Her steps were slow, her body heavy with the weight of pregnancy and exhaustion. As she made her way toward the front of the plane, passengers began to notice. Quiet murmurs spread through the cabin, and eyes followed her progress. Some looked on with curiosity, others with admiration for the unseen act of kindness that had prompted this unexpected scene. Sarah, though aware of the attention, kept her gaze focused ahead, her heart pounding with a mix of emotions, gratitude, relief, and disbelief. When she reached the first-class cabin, Barron stood up to greet her. His tall frame seemed even more imposing in the narrow aisle, but his expression was gentle, his demeanor calm. He offered her a small, warm smile and gestured toward the plush seat he had vacated. "It's all yours," he said softly, his voice steady but kind. Sarah hesitated, overwhelmed by the gesture. Her eyes searched his face for a moment, as if trying to understand why he would do this for her. "Thank you," she finally managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what this means to me." "It's no problem," Barron replied, his tone genuine and reassuring. "Take care of yourself and your little one." As Sarah settled into the seat, she felt a wave of comfort and relief wash over her. For the first time in hours, she could truly relax. The kindness of a stranger had turned her challenging day into one filled with hope. As Sarah settled into the luxurious first-class seat, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The seat's soft cushions seemed to cradle her weary body, and the gentle hum of the engines became a soothing backdrop. She wrapped the provided blanket around her shoulders, its warmth a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. For the first time in weeks, her aching back and swollen feet found respite, and she could finally take a deep, unlabored breath. Her hands instinctively rested on her belly as a soft smile spread across her face. The baby kicked lightly, as if sharing in her newfound peace. Meanwhile, Barron quietly navigated his way to the back of the plane, his tall frame drawing a few curious glances. When he reached Sarah's former seat, he sat down without a hint of irritation. The cramped space was a stark contrast to the comfort of first class, but Barron didn't seem to mind. The businessman beside him gave him a quick, indifferent glance before returning to his laptop, entirely unaware of the thoughtful gesture that had just occurred. Barron adjusted himself in the tight seat, his expression calm, embodying a quiet humility that went unnoticed by most around him. But the story didn't end there. As Sarah settled into the plush first-class seat, a sense of calm she hadn't felt in months began to take over. Beside her sat a middle-aged woman with warm, kind eyes who seemed to radiate a motherly presence. After a few moments of silence, Sarah turned to her, her voice still tinged with disbelief and emotion. "That young man," she began softly, as if saying it aloud would make it all feel real. "He gave up his seat for me. I don't even know his name." "Who does something like that?" The woman smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "That's Barron Trump," she said gently. "He's the son of the former president." Sarah's eyes widened in shock, her hands tightening instinctively on the blanket. "Really?" she whispered, glancing toward the back of the plane. She could just make out Barron's tall frame, squeezed into the tight economy seat he had taken without complaint. "I had no idea." The woman nodded, her expression thoughtful. "He's always been quiet, even as a child. Not one to seek the spotlight like the rest of his family. But from what I've heard, he has a good heart. What he did for you today says more about him than any headline ever could." Sarah leaned back in the seat, her mind racing. She hadn't expected kindness, let alone from someone whose life seemed worlds away from hers. Her gaze shifted back to Barron, who was reading a book as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Good heart," she murmured to herself, her voice filled with gratitude. In a world often filled with indifference, someone had noticed her struggle and chosen to act with selfless compassion. Over the next few hours, Sarah found herself opening up to the woman sitting beside her. There was something comforting about her kind smile and attentive demeanor, as if she were an old friend. Sarah began to share bits and pieces of her life, speaking in a soft voice that carried both weariness and hope. She explained how she was traveling to reunite with her husband, who was stationed overseas. It wasn't an easy journey, especially with the weight of pregnancy and the uncertainties of what lay ahead. Her husband's deployment had left her facing much of this time alone, but she spoke of how she had managed to get through it. Small acts of kindness from strangers had often been her saving grace. The woman nodded thoughtfully, offering small words of encouragement and understanding. She glanced occasionally toward Barron, seated in the cramped economy section, his long legs folded awkwardly. He seemed completely absorbed in his book, as though the kind gesture he had extended earlier was just another part of his day. As Sarah spoke, she felt a sense of relief. Sharing her story with someone who truly listened reminded her that, even in difficult times, there was still goodness in the world. As the flight neared its destination, the story of Barron's gesture began to ripple through the cabin. Passengers exchanged glances, some leaning over to share the tale with others. A flight attendant discreetly approached Barron, offering him a complimentary snack as a small token of appreciation. He declined with a polite smile, his focus still on his book. As the plane touched down and the passengers began to gather their belongings, Sarah stayed seated, her heart filled with a strange mix of gratitude and determination. She wasn't in a rush to leave. Instead, she wanted to find the young man who had shown her such unexpected kindness. Near the gate, as travelers hurried toward their destinations, Sarah lingered, scanning the crowd for his familiar tall frame. When Barron finally appeared, carrying a simple carry-on bag over his shoulder, she stepped forward hesitantly, unsure of what to say. Her voice was soft but steady as she called out, "Excuse me." Barron stopped and turned toward her, his expression as calm and composed as it had been on the plane. For a moment, Sarah struggled to find the right words. "I just wanted to thank you again for everything," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He nodded, offering her a faint smile. "You're welcome," he replied, his tone gentle and sincere. "I hope you have a safe trip and a healthy baby." Her eyes filled with tears as she smiled back, overwhelmed by his humility. "You've reminded me that there's still so much kindness in the world," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget this." Barron gave a modest nod before walking away, disappearing into the crowd. Sarah stood there for a moment, holding on to the warmth of his words and the kindness of his gesture, feeling a renewed sense of hope for the journey ahead. As Barron walked away, blending seamlessly into the bustling airport crowd, Sarah stood still for a moment, clutching her bag and processing the profound impact of his simple yet extraordinary kindness. That fleeting encounter had not only eased her physical discomfort, but also filled her heart with a renewed sense of hope. The genuine care and empathy from a young man she had never met before reminded her that compassion could transcend status, background, or any barriers society might impose. In the following days, the story began to spread. Fellow passengers shared the incident with family and friends, recounting the heartfelt moment when Barron Trump, son of former First Lady Melania Trump, selflessly gave up his first-class seat to a struggling pregnant woman. Social media platforms lit up as word spread, and soon admiration poured in from all corners. People praised Barron's act of kindness, but much of the credit was directed toward Melania Trump. Comments highlighted how she must have instilled strong values in her children, raising them with humility, grace, and a sense of responsibility toward others. "It's a reflection of good parenting," one post read. "Melania has clearly taught Barron the importance of empathy and generosity, regardless of privilege." The story became a testament to the power of small, thoughtful gestures. People from all walks of life expressed their admiration for Barron, not because of his famous last name, but because of his ability to see another person's struggle and take action. Sarah, meanwhile, carried the memory of Barron's gesture with her, sharing it with her husband and promising herself to pay the kindness forward. As the world celebrated the young man's selflessness, the moment stood as a powerful reminder. No matter who we are, it is our humanity and willingness to help others that truly define us. If this story of kindness moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming tales. And let us know in the comments if this story reminded you of the power of kindness. Share your thoughts and spread the message, because together we can make the world a better place, one kind act at a time.